speaking to Robert Stanton, who is in the A17th AIB. Thanks for coming. Give me your full name, when you were born, and where you're from.
My name is Robert Stanton. I was born in Camden, New Jersey in 1922, and I've lived in New Jersey all of my life. I now live in South Jersey, further south, actually below the Mason-Dixon line if it were extended.
Tell me at what age you were when you entered the Army and under what conditions?
I was subject to the draft, but I was finishing up a trade school course in industrial chemistry, and I asked for a 6-month deferment. And as soon as I graduated, I went down, and I upset the Army terribly by asking for immediate draft. And they didn't know what to do with me, but they took me anyway. And I was 20.
Where was your basic training at?
At Camp Fannin, Texas, which was Branch Immaterial Replacement Training Center. Later turned into an infantry replacement training center.
Tell me the journey to Barclay.
Well, of course, I had found myself eligible for ASTP when I went into the Army. And when I was at the reception center in Fort Dix, New Jersey, they said, "Oh, your mechanical aptitude score is excellent, so you can take any course you want in the Army." I said, "Well, I've got this wonderful sheet of paper that says I can go to the ASTP." "Oh," the fellow says, "great." So they bundled us up in a railroad car and took us down to Camp Fannin. And after basic training, we were interviewed by a lieutenant who said, "Oh, you did not have the right courses in high school. You took practical arts, I studied printing, and I took chemistry later." So he said, "I'm afraid you can't come." And I said, "I can handle it." And he said, "All right, I'm going to make an exception, and well, I want you to write to me after the first semester," which I did. And we went to Texas A&M, which I had always loved because we used to listen to them on the radio and hear the fight songs, which we could sing, and I found myself at fabulous Texas A&M, literally an Aggie. And after 3 months of excellent schooling and full intentions of having an engineering degree and a commission, why, we started the second semester and the rumors began to abound, and they said, "Sorry, fellows, we're breaking up the ASTP program." And they went down the hall, and every other man, alphabetically, every other person went to an infantry division, and we felt ourselves reasonably lucky going to an armored division. It sounded safer. And I had all my life read about trench warfare in Europe in World War I. I said, it's never going to be me. I'm never going to end up in the infantry. Of course, we all ended up in the infantry, armored or not. We found ourselves in Camp Barclay with a semi-hostile group who said, "Here come the whiz kids and all these college boys." And there we were.
Tell me about your captain.
Oh. Carl W. Helton was 1 year older than I was. He was not a West Pointer. He was not popular with the other officers who had been West Pointers. He probably was an ROTC captain. He was called Billy the Kid, which was affectionate, but Billy the Kid. He was tough, he was good, and he was envied by the other company commanders, as we learned later, as being very good and ran a good ship and was very forceful and very fair and very intelligent.
Did you feel that way about him when you first walked in?
We did not know him. We did not know him until we began to come up against him. At one point, I was called by a buddy of mine who told me that the division had a quota of 12 men for quartermaster OCS. And I said, "Get down and apply right now before it's too late." So I had to go to Captain Helton and go through the proper things. He said, "All right." I filled out the paper, sent it over to battalion executive officer, who was a really rotten person, said, "How come you don't have enough pride in your own outfit to put infantry first?" And I said, "Sir, infantry OCS is closed. We have a quota for quartermaster OCS." So I put Quartermaster first, infantry second, and engineering third. He said, dismiss. That was it. That was the end of it. No, no comeback, period. And at that time, the captain was very pleasant. Later on, when we heard that they had said, they've only been here 2 weeks and they're all applying for OCS, which was true. We felt cheated.
Tell me your general impression of training at Barclay.
It was reasonable. There was never anything nasty or mean, but it was tough. It was dusty, and it was Texas, eating Texas sand in our food, and it had its pleasant moments. We had funny moments, and we had some scary moments. Woke up one morning sleeping on a blanket, and there was a rattlesnake between the two of us. So fortunately, we rolled off to one side, and we dropped a big old limestone rock on it. And the fellow from Kentucky said, look out. He took his bayonet, cut the snake's head off. He says, y'all want that snake? We said, I want the rattles. He handed me the rattle, and he cooked and cleaned and cooked over an open fire and let us all taste rattlesnake meat. Tastes like fishy chicken. And there were moments down in West Texas where we came to places in the limestone where the streams had cut through for thousands of years. Great overhanging cliffs. Thousands and thousands of birds nesting underneath it, swallows probably. Armadillos going every direction. Wake up at night in the moonlight in the Texas desert. And everything was white stones and white ghosts, of course, everywhere. And very pretty from a Jersey boy who was not used to that kind of thing. We had fellows from all over the country, Oriental fellows, and my very first Hispanic friend I made while I was at Barclay. Taught me to sing Cuando se queda severo. Taught me how to cuss out the lieutenant in Spanish so I wouldn't know what he was saying. He was killed alongside of me later in Europe. Not in Hildesheim, later on.
Since we're going to scoot over, I'm going to pass New York because that experience is a lot alike. I want to know what it was like for you as you left England going to La Havre. What were you thinking?
I've got to say first.
Okay.
The first sight of Europe was the lowest corner of Ireland, and that was where my ancestors came from. That was special to me, just to see that little bit of Ireland. And then as we approached Liverpool, you could see these stacks like little tugboats swinging back and forth before you could see the boats themselves. And England was a joy. That was a joy. But crossing the channel to Le Havre, I was fortunate because I went into the half tracks, whereas the rest of the fellows went on the boats. And the ship was LST number 1. You know, given for the original number, built in Pittsburgh, all the way down the river and all the way over to England. And we found that the Navy was eating wonderful food. And when they were done in the kitchen, the Army cooks came in and cooked up a slap that the Army cooked. And they put us on KP to serve the officers' mess. So we made a deal with the Navy messmen that rather than wait on tables for our officers, we would do dishes for both the Army and the Navy if they served tables for both. So we ate the Navy food and made sure they got the Army food except for the bread. We let them have the Navy bread. The Navy had an awful dirty trick. When they done with food, they would dump it over the side. There was no saving food for the next meal. Over the side. And the GIs would have loved to have had some of that good stuff. And then we drove off the half-track, drove off the LST onto the shore at Le Havre, which very fortunately had been captured by the Canadians a week or a month before, and we were very grateful for that. And we went to the Chateau de Bosmolay, which had been a German V-1 launching ramp. And they had storage warehouses in it, shaped like a curve, so if a bomb dropped, the blast wouldn't get into the German V-1s, but it had been bombed outside, ruined by the Allied bombs. And when they built it so hurriedly, they left the boards on the inside of the concrete, the form boards, so we tore them all off and hammered and made bunks out of them and filled them full of hay. our own outfit joined us about that time. And we knew we were going into hell, but we didn't talk about it with each other. And at one time, a cow got caught in a bomb crater, and we couldn't get it out. And they tried. The wrecker, which is a big truck that pulls tanks, tried. Guys, nobody could get the cow out of this water-filled bomb crater. So we hauled straight, and I found this French farmer. He said, and he came over, he cut a stick, and went there and said, allez, hit the cow twice, and the cow came right up out of the ditch. And I own cows now myself, and I never have forgotten that experience. This was apple territory. We ate apples. There was apple cider. They call it cider. It was a lightly fermented cider. It had a little bit of an alcohol content. We drank that. They made Calvados, which was apple cider with alcohol in it, distilled. So it got stronger and stronger. That was their strong drink, and it was awful. It had a taste like you wouldn't believe. We got sick on it and drunk on it and everything else. But the chateau itself had been, a bomb had dropped in it because the Germans were using it for officers' headquarters. Again, Paul Strait went back and met the now French government property, but he found a book by Madame Bosmolay about the wartime operations. So there's a connection that we love. We talked about a lot, at least from what I've been involved in and everything. So then we moved up to Loonville, which was a staging point. We all cut each other's hair. It was a terrible job. We threw it in the fire, and it stunk so bad that we all got sick. And we knew very well that we were headed to the front. It had been a French army barracks, and you'll forgive me, but it had, the toilets were hole in the floor, concrete hole in the floor, and a handle to hold on to. And the Germans had used it, and it still had the German words on the side. Führer Befehl wir folgen dir. Führer Lee, we follow you, and all kinds of German cartoons and dirty cartoons on the walls, and emphasized with red crayon and paint. It was just the way they had left it, and probably not too long before. Then we took off to the front, and of course you could see the flashing in the sky of the shells going up, and you could begin to hear the rumble of the cannon sputting in. We knew it.
What were you feeling? What
Scared the hell. We knew we were heading for the worst possible thing we could do. We didn't want to run. Nobody wanted to. You wish you could have done anything at all to get out of there, but you don't run. And it was December the 7th that we moved into combat. It was Pearl Harbor Day. It was a significant day for us. And the very first thing they did was hand us German prisoners to take back. And they were kids. They were 16, 17-year-olds, no more. And they were all hollering, Wasser, Wasser. They were all dying of thirst. Can you imagine the stress, plus not having their own supplies and didn't march for a long period of time. So we gave them water, hoping someday they'd do the same thing for one of us. So we took them back, told the guys, be sure and get plenty of water. So I continued. And the very first night, the town of Binning, B-I-N-I-N-G, there were too many of us. We replaced some units of another division, I think the 44th. There were so many of us, they could just go inside these barns on the side of the road. So we were in pitch black, we went into the barns, and there was straw on the floor, and we lay down on the straw. We put our heads on something, which the next morning turned out to be a dead calf, but who cared? And we were rudely awakened the next morning by mortar shells coming down the street. Boom, boom, boom. Boom! And the lieutenant, nameless, said, what do we do, Sergeant? Shall we get the men out in the field? No, Sergeant, now, just take it easy now, Lieutenant. He said, the mortar shells will hit these tiles and they'll go sideways. And we felt like our bodies were going to flow out of us at the moment. We were all so scared. And the minute Sergeant Bixby said those words, we all calmed down. And many years later at San Antonio, I got to sit next to that good old soldier. He was in his 80s, and his old blue eyes, and I told him what he did for us that day. Got to close the loop with him. Great, great old man.
Tell me about when you were walking into your first action.
they grabbed me and said, "We need someone to carry a flamethrower. Give us your rifle, buckle on the flamethrower, here's how it works. Joe here will come with you and he'll turn the valve and you aim it into a cellar or a bunker or whatever you need." And in the meantime, the company had moved off up towards Rohrbach, and we started up, and there was an artillery forward observer with us. So we stuck with him because he was heading up front too. And all of a sudden, American shells began to drop on us. And I can still hear him say, get 'em up, you're coming in on me." And about that time, a phosphorus shell landed. That's terrible stuff. Burned right through your skin. And I saw this beautiful thing of white coming down at us, and I ran and to a ditch, and I hit the stone wall of the ditch, and I broke every valve off that flamethrower. It was no good. And that left me with no weapons. So then, after that was over, we started up the hill towards Rohrbach. And the last house in town, big farmhouse, we went into the hof, or the courtyard, and this very nice Alsatian couple came out and said, "Are you all right? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty?" And we said no, and they said, "Your men went that way." So we went that way, down the road, and bullets began to come over our head. So we jumped off the road into a ditch, and a shell landed right where we had been walking. So we cut across the road, we caught sight of somebody. Later on, it turned out there was a German observer up in that top of that building, and they knew it. They knew it, but they couldn't say. And they may have been sympathizers for all they know. So someone went back later on and rousted him out there and got rid of him. But he was calling in rifle fire and shell fire, and with pure luck, we had walked off the road just as the shell came in. They were willing to waste one shell on two guys. I guess that was a reasonable road. So then we spent the night digging holes in the ground on a slope leading up to the, I think it was a railway embankment. And I will never forget that cold night, first cold night sleeping out in the muddy field. We dug down, and then we dug sideways a little bit, so at least our heads were underneath it. There, it could have been intoned, but at least didn't want shrapnel to fall on our faces. It was scary. But sometimes you're so busy and so excited you don't get as scared as you would be if you sat and contemplated it. And later on you sit and contemplate, why in the world did we ever do that kind of thing?
Tell me about Herleshheim, where you were at, and when you got into the battle.
Okay. At that next day, where I left off, Captain Helton said that some guys had laid up on, wounded guys had laid up on the hill and did not have proper attention. And he said, "I want one guy from each platoon to be litter bearers. Turn in your weapons, put on armbands, put red crosses on your helmet, and you will carry guys back." So we immediately began to carry guys, four of us, back on stretchers. And through many days of in-between combat and all that, we were the litter bearers of the company. And when we were heading for Herleshheim, we were moving up slowly towards it. And I said, "Hurry up and wait." And we laid in a field, and it was so cold you couldn't make a mark in the ground, so you found furrows in the roads. And I was reading, we had those little books, did everybody ever mention the little books we had, the Armed Services books? They were condensations of full-size book, but they were just the right size to slip into your field jacket pocket. I'm sitting there reading the history of art in the Western Hemisphere or something like this. It was the only book I had, and scared to death of keeping my mind on something else. We had something called D rations. They were a hard block of chocolate. Nobody could bite into it. You gnawed on it like a dog. And you got a little bit of it. It was a mixture of chocolate and wheat and God knows what else, but you gnawed on it. It was just enough sustenance to keep you going. And every so often, German anti-tank shells would come in trying to hit the tanks that were right alongside of us. And an anti-tank shell sometimes has no explosives in it. It's a piercing round. It would hit the ground and skid across the ground, making big black marks, and it sounded like 1,000 automobiles skidding on a highway. And then the casualties began to come back, and they said there was a tanker had his leg blown off. and a tourniquet on his leg. So we carried him back to an aid station and came back. And then somebody said, here's a guy, he's blinded. So he had a patch over his eye. So Stanton, you take him back. So I took him back, and I had to cross an engineer bridge to get back on the other side. And while I was over there, the shelling started on the engineer bridge, and I couldn't get back. And then I don't, to this day, know what happened, but I woke up. So it must have been a shell went off somewhere close to me and didn't hit me, but the concussion knocked me out. And I wandered back to where the other guys were waiting, and they said I didn't make sense. So they put me in an ambulance that took me back, and it was the luckiest moment of my life. Although my other 3 litter bearers, none of them were captured or hurt. So if I'd been with them, I would have probably still been all right. And by the time I got back up, Hurlesheim was over. Lucky me. And I joined them in Strasbourg. They were just outside of Strasbourg. And they asked,
did you go to the 82nd? Did you go back to the 82nd Medical, or did you?
Well, certainly passed through them, and I don't know where I was. Someplace back in the line, they fed us and kept us warm. It's okay, you feel all right? Yeah, okay, going back up, you know. And they said, that counts as a Purple Heart. I said, well, we knew about points, and we didn't want to miss a chance to get points. So I cheerfully took a Purple Heart for a concussion, but I felt guilty about it ever since, but at least it was a point, 2 or 5 or something. So when I rejoined them, we found what had happened, and Captain Helton, and Major Logan, and everybody else practically was captured, except for a few brave guys that got out of there, and that's some other good stories we've been telling all week here. And they said, would you like to take a squad? And I said, no, thank you. Continue to be a litter bearer. And so we proceeded to do just that. But what happened was that we became assistant aid men. I carried everything from Pepto-Bismol for upset stomachs to morphine, pocket full of first aid kits, and we took care of minor scratches and things like that. The aid men were busy with the real casualties, so we became assistant aid men. And we were in the Colmar pocket, and we had a lot of things to do down there, which I'll tell you about.
Yeah.
Colmar was the next big battle, and it was important because it was to get the last of the Germans out of this side of that side of the Rhine. And one morning we were in the second Hurlesheim. Has anybody mentioned second Hurlesheim? We all laughed at it. Hurlesheim played Colmar. And the next morning, after a night of mortar shells coming in on us, where we slept under wine vats where they come together. There was a place underneath there that seemed like a safe mouse hole to hide in, and mortars couldn't get us. The next morning, we're milling around. It turned out the Germans had left and moved back. Outside was a tank, a light tank, and it went bang! And we said, what is that? Somebody said, they put a shell on the top of the building. I think it's a German observer up there. So we just moved on. Finally, they came to us and said, there's 2 children dead up in the building. Go up and carry them down. Oh. It was a winding staircase, stone tower, like a castle, and couldn't even use the stretcher. We had to take an arm and a leg, and they were big kids. They were teenagers, like 14 and 16, carrying down. The families were upset, and the old grandpappy was in charge, and we put him down, covered him up. It was a terrible day. And then we went outside and we talked to other teenage Alsatian kids, and they wanted to talk. We knew a little bit of English. And then we went down the street. I'm still waiting for orders to move on. There was a butcher shop, and the butcher invited us in. Said he wanted his daughter to marry an American. And this kind of chunky little Alsatian girl was there grinning at us, and they brought out cake made with honey because there was no sugar. And he had wine. He got us all half smashed on his wine. And he didn't know the Star Spangled Banner, so he played God Save the King. He knew that one. So we left that town in a haze of alcohol. Now sometimes that was the one way to avoid getting too scared, was to get half drunk. Not so you couldn't perform, but at least so you could
Have an escape.
Yeah.
How did you went in, how did you feel, or generally, how did y'all feel about replacements? Was there ever was it different after the original?
They were non-entities at first, because we didn't have time to stop and make new friends. We lost a lot of our old friends, and these young fellows came in, we said hello, they took their places in the half tracks, and we we couldn't do much because you're moving on. There was not much you could do. Not much you could train. If they hadn't been trained by then, they were told to keep your eyes on the old guys. Well, they get behind a tree, you get behind a tree, and that's what we did. My whole philosophy that kept me from getting killed, I guess, was to keep my head down. Keep your head down till you need it. One terrible day in one of the small German cities we went through in the Rhineland, I was standing on a street talking to two of the 82nd medics, and somebody hollered, "Medic!" And I said, "I'll take it." And I went over, and one of our fellows, can't think of his name, had a superficial wound at the side of his head that scared the daylights. I knocked him silly. So I patched him up and dusted him and patched him up and sent him back in the Jeep. I went back to where I had been standing, and a mortar shell had hit right where I had been standing and blew the feet off the other two medics. He died, black with blood. I mean, I said, Lord, it was with me at that moment, got me out of there. But I told the fellow, I told me to save my life by getting wounded because I went up to help him and took me away from that spot. His wife and daughter are here always. I'm doing I just can't think of his name. So there were many, many little things you forget as you go along. And then we started to drive to the Rhine, and we went down the German Autobahn, and we stopped, and the German plane came, and the entire company jumped down, ran out in the field in case the guy was going to hit us, and he didn't do it. And later on, about the same time, the first German jet we had ever seen came over and dropped a bomb and killed the mess truck. Didn't hit anybody else. It killed the mess truck. The worst possible damage you could do. It killed the mess truck. And then we kept making these mounted attacks, patrols back and forth. The armored divisions were meant to do the same thing the German Blitzkrieg did. And our officials, our officers, misused them earlier. That's why they got into trouble at Hurlsheim. They just needed bodies and guns, and they sent an armored division in to act as infantry, which they weren't trained to do. But when we went north and joined Patton, and swung down through the Siegfried line into the Rhineland, then we rolled, and we rolled, and we rolled, and we came into towns, and the Germans were so startled to see us that their helmets were up on their tanks and their trucks, and their guns were hanging someplace else, and they put their hands up. And then we went into the same Gasthouses, saloons that they had been using, and drank the same beer they had just been drinking out of our canteen cups.
So you think a lot of that was just plain old surprise?
Absolutely. They had no idea we were there. And of course they were suffering from every kind of deficiency because of the bombings, and we saw German guns being pulled by horses and wooden wheeled artillery pieces. They had two armies. They had the highly mechanized, what they call Panzer armies, and they had the regular army, which was a generation behind. Some of the horses were badly wounded, and the farm boys would go right out and put the horses out of their misery because they had understood the situation with compassion. And as I said, many times we hid behind cows because they were wonderful absorbers of bullets. The cow would absorb a lot of bullets. I have cows of my own now, and I think about that a lot. But as we came down through these mountains and surprised these German troops, we all said, boy, that's the way to fight a war. You might lose somebody once in a while, but he kept the enemy so off balance, he reeled. He did not know what to do it. Of course, that was when we were close to winning the war. That was in March. 2 more months to go, and we had them. So,
if you were to think about your war experience, what would be that one occurrence that always would pop in your mind?
my last day in combat, we were on a mounted patrol, and I was in the lead half track of the 3rd platoon, and I was allowed to ride because I had been my platoon before I was made a litter bearer, and each of the 4 litter bearers rode in a separate platoon half track. It was the platoon commander's half track, And Lieutenant Drost was up front, Sergeant Kaplinger in the middle, and Willard Pottinger was driving, and the rest of the fellows were all arrayed around the side, and I always sat in the left rear door of the seat with my hand on the door. I wanted to be sure if we had to get out, I knew I could get that door open. And we came over a hill and right smack into the German lines. And nobody knew it. And they had 50 caliber machine gun was operating and two 30 caliber machine guns. And it was like John Wayne's story, The War Wagon, where they had this Gatling gun on an old horse and wagon coming down against the Indians. And I told everybody it was like a war wagon, because those Germans were so scared to see this tremendous thing coming down the hill at them that they were jumping up and running like rabbits in all directions. But they had a anti-tank gun down at the road intersection, and we took a round right in the front of the half track. There was 3/4 inch armor on the front of the half track, and went right through it. It cut Sergeant Kaplinger in half, badly wounded Lieutenant Drost. It killed 5 or 6 guys in between, and I got all kinds of shrapnel on me. And Tommy Napolitano across from me blew his helmet off and got nothing at all. So I had the door open without thinking about it, and we were out, and the Pottinger got out, the driver, and Lieutenant Drost got out, and said, we thought we were going to be captured because we were in the middle of their lines, and I had all kinds of souvenirs in my pocket. I took them out, threw them on the ground. I didn't want to be captured with things from the German army on my body. And Lieutenant Drost formed a firing line. He said, get over here, you guys. Come up here and have a firing line. So, and then Sergeant Childs, who was his staff sergeant, was tracked behind us. He came up and joined us. And Lieutenant Drost was badly injured. And I'm laying alongside of him, and he says, ouch! Stanton, did you shoot me in the ass? And I said, no, Lieutenant, I don't have a gun. The rifle bullet had creased him and missed me because he was just that much heavier than I was. And he said, do you have any morphine? And I said, yes. He said, put it right here. So he rolled his sleeve up, and I stuck morphine in his sleeve. And he's directing the fire. He said, now you go back and tell Captain Ferguson to get fire on that little copse of woods down there. That's where that gun is. And this guy is badly injured. He should have had a medal for it. So I went back. I had to stop and patch up 2 guys on the way back who had shrapnel wounds, again, little head wounds. And I went back and told Captain Ferguson what Lieutenant Drost said. And then I got an ambulance and left. But before I left, this particular reunion is special for me because I saw this medic captain carrying a Red Cross flag right down the street towards our half track, followed by several of his aidmen, right in the teeth of the German firing, right down to get whatever wounded or see whether they help anybody inside the track. Another of my heroes is Captain Petronio that I got to meet this time. And I told him, and I said, I put my arms around him. I said, you are one of my heroes. I've been waiting to shake your hand for 50-some years now. So this was so special. In Omaha, I understood that Lieutenant Drost would be there, and I wanted to meet him. And we're riding in the tour bus out to Boys Town. And I'm talking to a fellow across the aisle. What's your unit? What's your name? It's Lieutenant Drost, sitting next to me in the bus. And I said, you don't know how I have waited to see you. And every time I told him how brave I thought he was and how I wanted to meet him, he put it down. He said, oh, I didn't do anything. And I said, I should have written to the company commander and told him I thought you had that old, because privates don't write to company commanders, at least in that day. But that's, that was the best. So there's 3 of my heroes, Bixby, Drost, and Petronio. So that day was a terrible day. And later on in San Antonio, George Hatton said, never have ever talked to anybody before that was in that half track that day. Everybody left, killed or left. So they sat down and made an audio tape, which then he had typed and I had retyped. So the story of that day is there. At St. Louis, one of the other meetings, a fella came up. He says, were you in the half track that day? And I said, yeah. He says, I wasn't. I said, why weren't you? He says, I fell asleep in a hay pile somewhere and missed the guys when they took off.
Hay trucks.
Yeah. And he broke into tears when I told him that if he'd been sitting on that track, he'd have been dead. Homer Petros. Yeah. Yeah, he's dead. And Lieutenant Drost died from the same injury years later. He said, I've got all this German iron in my lungs, and it finally killed him. I was able to write to his family, said, told them what I had told him, and don't forget that. And Pappy Childs, another, he lived near me. I went to see him and talked to his grandson. I said, don't forget, the bravest guys you ever met. That's a Fort hero. So I saw guys were a lot braver than me, and I appreciated it. And like Sergeant Bixby, you see those 83-year-old man with those blue eyes, just all shining like it was back in the combat. Well, my whole summary of combat was how fortunate I was. The Lord has other work in mind for me. He kept me safe through all that.
What did you learn about yourself in war?
I am nothing else if I'm not a survivor and an adapter. Maybe I hid behind, put my head down too far. No, I never thought I was brave. I didn't try to be brave. I was not a hero. That's why I appreciate those that were. That's why I appreciate those that were. I knew I didn't want to be where I was and didn't want to run away, but you did the best you could. You know.
If you were to leave a message for those that come after you, what would it be about war and what you experienced?
It's a terrible, horrible thing. And we used to say that if the leaders of the world could be in infantry combat for one day, the whole war would stop. I must say that this garbage about what a terrible thing we did dropping the atomic bomb on the Japanese is just garbage by people who couldn't possibly understand. Every single one of us would have pushed the button for Harry Truman, one of my heroes. And people say it was a terrible thing. I said, of course it was a terrible thing. Every bomb dropped on Coventry was a terrible thing. Every bomb dropped on Dresden was a terrible thing. And every guy who shot another guy was a terrible thing. War is a terrible thing. I didn't want to be part of it. I couldn't escape it. It was the greatest outstanding point in my life, which, reluctantly or not, it is a turning point in your life. And you can look back with pride. I said, I'd never again be scared of anything, except that lightning scared me because it sounds just like shells coming in. Unexpected. It's a random hit, and boom, it hits you just like the shells would come in on you. To this day, I gather my family away from the walls and away from the things, and we stay over here until the lightning is over. It's just like shell fire to me. Just like.
What was your career after the war?
I was fortunate enough because I had a disabling wound in my leg. Yeah, I got shrapnel in my forehead, in my ear, and the piece went through into my leg. But everything in my pocket stopped shrapnel, and all these first aid kits stopped the shrapnel. The one piece went in, killed the feeling in my leg, and kept me limping for a while, and they gave me a 20% permanent disability, which then qualified me for Public Law 16, not the GI Bill, rehabilitation of a wounded veteran, so forth. They took a battery of tests, and I, all flying colors to VA. What do you want to be? I want to be an MD. Oh, he says, do you have even 1 week of pre-med before you went into service? I said, no. He said, I'm sorry. What's your second choice? I said, chemical engineer. He says, you got it. So they came away all through school, all the books, subsistence the whole time. It was a beautiful thing. They couldn't have done any more for me than they did. I met a doctor later on, exactly the same thing happened. He said, well, if I go back and take pre-med and finish that, then will you take me through? And they said, yes. I said, you were smarter than I was. He asked the right question. So I have had a tremendous, wonderful life ever since. Everything has gone my way.
Was this shrapnel wound, that was the day that you were in the...
March 23rd, 1995, I guess.
So that was the end of your service then?
Unless we had fought the Japanese, then I would have been quickly rehabilitated and they'd found something for me to do. And in 1947, the shrapnel worked its way to the surface. And the surgeon cut it out. He says, what's this? And I said, it's 1/3 of a windage knob from an M1 rifle. It was secondary shrapnel because one of the guys, his rifle had been hit by some of the German shrapnel and drove it into me. So that's how imprecise the war is.
So do you have any more shrapnel left?
A little piece here, a little piece here, a little piece here. You're going for MRI, they make you show you where it all is. So say what those spots are. It's tiny. Oh, for years afterwards, you'd be washing your face, a wash rag, and a piece would come out. But the last two pieces are still there. Look how blind to me. I have limited vision in my left eye. I lied to get into the military. I lied to get into ASTP. I lied, and then when I got into infantry, I tried to get out, and they said, "Sorry, too late now." I tried everything. Then nothing worked.
If you were looking back, what is the funniest thing that you ever experienced in the Army? I know it was sad, but surely there were some fun times.
Oh, you bet. Happy Childs, who was at least 40 years old, was an old cook from Newark, New Jersey. And we came back from maneuvers in Camp Barkley one time. He had a big pot of coffee cooking over an open fire, and he's got these socks coming out of the coffee. It shows he washed these socks in the coffee, which he really hadn't. He got some new socks, filled them with coffee grounds, and used them to make the coffee. Everybody said, "Hey, Pappy, we always thought you washed your socks in the coffee. Now we're sure of it." There's lots of funny things. That was really hilarious. Later on in combat, he came up to the front with hot coffee and apple fritters. And nowhere in the Army recipe are apple fritters listed, but being an old experienced cook, he knew when to take dried apples and things and make apple fritters. And he brought up a big urn of coffee and two big things of apple fritters. And that lieutenant who wouldn't let me go to CS, he was there, right there, being very officious. We all started to salute him. And he said, "Oh, you don't have to salute up here." We said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We hope the sniper would see us." And he got in the Jeep and run away. My vengeance.
Well, who was the guy in y'all's, in your company that was, okay, okay. Thanks for coming. Our battery's about to go out.
I forget.
It was great.